Microphones are live, ready when you are.
Excellent. Good morning. How are you? I say that because I really love hearing you. I work in radio, of course, and we are recording today. Welcome to the Adelaide Writers' Week. What a wonderful event this is, and our session is Bad Energy. My name is Natasha Mitchell. I'm from ABC Radio National, or RN. I'm a science broadcaster, amongst other things. Host our weekly podcast and program called Science Friction, which is all about culture and science. And that is, of course, those are both big themes for today's session. I want to acknowledge, and I am delighted to be joining you on Kaurna country. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. COVID safe. Many of you are wearing masks, some of you aren't. Maybe just be sensitive to that. We have COVID marshals, pay attention to those if they instruct us in particular ways. And you know, social distancing at a festival is a bit of a challenge, isn't it? But we're all doing the very best we can in the circumstances we can. I really can't think of a more timely discussion than this one about the moral challenge of where the world gets its energy from. And in particular, the moral questions about, or triggered by the raw materials that Australia sends to the rest of the world to supply energy, to create energy, fossil fuels and uranium. I wonder if, like me, you've been watching what's happening in Ukraine. It is completely devastating. Russia has seized control of nuclear power plants. The spectre of nuclear war is back in our psyche, as it was for many of us who grew up in the Cold War. It's a terrifying sort of time to be watching on. And then again, we also think of the recent UN Climate Summit in Glasgow. And Australian governments have tended to argue that our domestic emissions are tiny, just 1.3%, as a contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. But what about all the emissions associated with the fossil fuels we export? We are the biggest coal exporter in the world, to the rest of the world. So what's our liability? These are all the themes we're going to talk about today with these marvellous guests. Ian Lowe, Emeritus Professor of Science, Technology and Society at Griffith University, one of Australia's leading science and environment scholars. He's a prolific author. You would have read many of his books, but his new one is called Long Half-Life, The Nuclear Industry in Australia, drawing partly on his incredible knowledge as when he served on the Radiation Health and Safety Advisory Council for 13 years, but many other roles related as well. We also have Jeremy Moss with us. He's Professor of Political Philosophy at the University of New South Wales. His books include Reassessing Egalitarianism, Climate Justice Beyond the State, and Climate Change and Justice. His new book is called Carbon Justice. Please give them a mighty welcome.
Thank you.
So, what do you make of the present moment and its relevance to our discussion about the energy choices we make, and also what happens to the raw materials we send off to the rest of the world? We're all watching on at the moment, the floods, Ukraine. Here we are again. Ian?
Well, it's a scary moment. The decisions we're taking now will influence the future of civilization. Indeed, you could argue they'll influence whether civilization will have a future. And in the past, we've regarded exporting coal and exporting uranium simply as an economic activity for which we have no moral responsibility. But Jeremy's book makes a powerful case that we are morally responsible for the emissions that are associated with our exports of fossil fuels. And I make the case in my book that even people like Malcolm Fraser, a former Liberal Prime Minister, now acknowledge that we are morally culpable for the threat of nuclear weapons, which is an inevitable result of our exporting uranium. So we really need to be aware of those factors that in the past we've seen these just as something that employs a few people and makes a bit of money, but it's much more serious than that.
Well, makes more than a bit of money, makes a whole lot of money.
Well, in the case of coal it does, but in the case of uranium, the economic return is relatively trivial. It ranks with such major minerals as tin and tantalum as an export revenue. In fact, in the last year for which I found figures, Australia made more money exporting cheese than we did exporting uranium. And I make the point that radioactive waste is more unsavoury than an old gorgonzola, and the safeguards arrangements have more holes than a Swiss cheese. So I really think if we're that desperate for export revenue, we should ramp up cheese exports and stop exporting uranium.
World peace begins with cheese. And here is the tenor of our conversation today. Jeremy Moss, how are you viewing the present moment?
Well, look, unfortunately, it's a sad reminder of the company we keep. When you go overseas, or when I go overseas, well, you remember that, to attend climate events, you know, often people think of Australia as this nice place full of lovely people and so on. But when you attend climate events, Australians are actually the bad guys. And we're the bad guys because at global climate negotiations, the people we side with are people like Vladimir Putin, countries like Russia or the government of Russia and Saudi Arabia. We combine with those countries to thwart effective global action on climate change. And the conflict in Ukraine at the moment just reminds us what an appalling and, in fact, shameful role we play in global climate negotiations. Australia, amongst other countries, is a wrecker of those negotiations. And the current opprobrium towards Putin's regime should remind us that we need to keep better global company.
And of course, we'll get to the connection between these two themes because, of course, nuclear power plants are seen as a solution to global warming, and we can unpack that in more detail. Jeremy, what are you describing as Australia's greatest climate scandal?
Well, what I mean by that is that thought came about to me because I was looking into how much emissions Australia produced within our territorial boundaries. And per capita, it's a lot, okay? We're one of the worst per capita emitters on Earth. But I quickly realised that even if we were to go carbon neutral overnight, the emissions that come from the export of our coal, oil and gas would be double our annual domestic emissions each and every year. And so it struck me that we cannot be serious about taking action about climate change, about achieving net zero, while pretending, or at least taking some action to cut our emissions at home, while encouraging and continuing to export vast amounts of fossil fuel abroad. It is simply scandalous to think that you can be serious about climate change when you have that dichotomy between action at home, no matter how small, but increased fossil fuel exports abroad. Those two things just cannot go together. And I think it's the great scandal of Australia's contribution to climate change.
Give us a sense of the scale. For example, you group together the 10 carbon major companies operating in Australia, so the 10 largest fossil fuel companies exporting fossil fuels to the rest of the world, gas, oil, coal. What are the emissions associated with their exports in other countries?
I do in the book talk about what I call the carbon majors, so the big fossil fuel exporting companies like BHP or Glencore or Santos or Woodside Petroleum. And these are the guys that actually dig up the stuff and sell it. But you could be forgiven for thinking, listening to Scott Morrison and others, that it's the Australian government who does all this, and they certainly have a hand in it. But it's these big companies that produce all the material and export it. And it's about 1,000 megatons of CO2 equivalent gas a year that come from the burning of our fossil fuels in other countries. So that's about double our domestic emissions. And this is, again, I keep using the word scandalous because these companies benefit a great deal from this export. We benefit a lot less than you think. And half these companies, half the top 10 in any given year, pay zero, not a little, zero corporate tax. Not only that, we subsidise them with billions of dollars each year to continue exporting these fossil fuels. And that makes the equation for the benefits to Australia not very good, frankly.
You say that if you added up all the top 10 carbon major companies, they would be equivalent to the 8th largest emitter in the world.
Yes, that's right. If you were to, they'd rank just below Russia and Germany and the US and China. And that's an extraordinary thing to think about, because at the global negotiations, however badly they go, they're trying to get countries to take responsibility for what they're doing. But these companies don't have responsibility for the production of fossil fuels and the sale and the harms that sale and consumption does. They escape liability. They don't pay for the climate harms. As I've said, they barely pay tax. And what's more, they're leaving us with a time bomb of unrehabilitated mines and climate harms, which we'll all be paying for a very long time. And so I think we need to focus a bit of attention on the liabilities, moral and financial, that these companies ought to bear as we start to transition seriously towards net zero.
And there are interesting arguments that contest your claim, so we will explore those further. Ian Lowe, in the 1970s, you made the case that Australia should be responsible for the consequences of what happens with our uranium exports. And in your book, you look at really the entire history of the nuclear industry in Australia. It's fascinating, all the choices we made, all the debates that were unleashed, and you in South Australia know that very well from conversations about a nuclear waste facility, many different conversations of a nuclear waste facility. But when you proposed that we should be responsible for any consequence associated with uranium exports, what was the response from the industry and others?
Oh, well, I mean, I remember early on there was discussion about the fact that if we export uranium, that creates a problem of radioactive waste that has to be managed, and it also creates a risk that fissile material could be misused and turned into weapons. And in 1977, in the debate about the Fox report, which made those points, I suggested that there was a technical solution to these problems, which is that instead of selling uranium, we could perhaps lease it on condition that it was returned to Australia. And that way we would ensure that the fissile material wasn't turned into weapons, and we would ensure that the waste was responsibly managed. The uranium mining companies almost dived under the table with their alarm at this suggestion.
What, they didn't go, "Oh, Ian, we've been waiting for that argument all our lives"?
Absolutely not. And interestingly, the South Australian Royal Commission also raised with the uranium exporters the possibility that instead of exporting uranium, they might take responsibility for it. My interpretation of their alarm is that they thought they had a social licence to operate while they were just exporting it and creating a few jobs and a bit of revenue in Australia, and we didn't have to take responsibility for the end result. And I think they believed, probably quite rightly, that if we had to take responsibility for managing the waste,
so product stewardship,
the social licence would evaporate, and the community would not tolerate it. And we saw that in South Australia when there was a proposal for South Australia to take in the world's dirty nuclear washing. The citizens' jury voted 2-1 against that proposal because they didn't think the risk justified the real or alleged economic return that would result. So I think at the moment, with both coal and uranium, we're doing an out-of-sight, out-of-mind approach. You know, we're happy to export it, we're happy to see the revenue, but we don't want to take responsibility for the consequences. And that's an attitude that you'd rebuke your 5-year-old child for, that we need to take responsibility for our actions. And at the moment, internationally, we're behaving like a spoilt child who will not take responsibility for the consequences of what we're doing.
Well, we're meeting a market need. There are consumers that want our products and we're selling them to them. I mean, the consumers are making choices.
Well, that's what Jeremy calls the arms dealer's defence. If we didn't sell it, somebody else would. And in any case, we don't burn the coal, we just sell it. And that's implying that we seriously think that people are going to store the coal under their bed. They're not going to burn it. I mean, the only reason anyone buys coal is to burn it. And the only reason anyone buys uranium is to generate very expensive and dirty electricity or to make weapons. And, it's naive to assume that there is any other motive for buying uranium. I mean, it's very heavy. I suppose it could make paperweights that glow in the dark, but fundamentally the only reason people buy uranium is to fuel nuclear reactors, and that inevitably produces waste, and it inevitably produces fissile material that can be turned into weapons.
But it also produces energy. And do we have a clear understanding of where our uranium ends up and what it's used for? I know that countries who do buy our uranium are required to sign an agreement that ensures that it's only used for energy and not used for weapons. But we are exporting to India, aren't we? And they haven't signed the non-proliferation treaty, nuclear non-proliferation treaty.
That's right, and I still remember the picture of a beaming John Howard shaking hands with Vladimir Putin to negotiate an agreement to sell uranium to Russia. We sell uranium to China. When Malcolm Fraser's government in 1977 agreed to start exporting uranium from the Ranger mine, he said that we would have the strictest safeguards in the world. But every time the commercial reality got in the way of a safeguard, it wasn't the deal that went down the drain, it was the safeguard. And one by one, the safeguards that were announced in 1977 have been steadily watered down.
What sorts of safeguards?
Well, safeguards like the uranium couldn't be sold to a third party, it couldn't be enriched beyond 5% uranium-235, that the facilities would remain under the jurisdiction of the International Atomic Energy Authority. And even there, I note in the book that the then head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mohammed El-Baradei, lamented the fact that he's expected to police over 500 nuclear installations around the world with a budget comparable to that of a metropolitan police force. And wherever he looked, there was the phrase in the industry is material unaccounted for. So he documented in Japan the fact that their nuclear regulator lamented the fact that 70 kilograms of plutonium were missing somewhere in the system that couldn't be accounted for. And you need 5 or 10 kilograms to make a decent-sized nuclear weapon. So it's, we're really playing with fire.
It's been interesting watching the International Atomic Energy Agency respond to the threat against nuclear power plants in Ukraine at the moment. They seem to be sort of clasping at straws in a way. They're tweeting and I don't know, I haven't seen strong enough statements about what will protect those plants.
No, you're right. And I made the point a long time ago that building nuclear power stations implicitly presupposes eternal peace. Because the last time there was a serious shooting war, power stations were legitimate targets, because if you destroy a power station, you restrict your enemy's capacity to produce weapons and fight against you. So if we build nuclear power stations, we should recognise that even an attack with conventional explosives on a nuclear power station would have unimaginable consequences, pollution of an area for basically for thousands of years. And the latest mad thought bubble by our Commonwealth government that we should have nuclear submarines. I mean, the idea that you would put a nuclear reactor in a fighting ship, which an enemy will try and destroy. I mean, the radiological consequences of a nuclear submarine being destroyed are just unthinkable.
40 years into the future, it's quite an investment. Jeremy Moss, let's explore the argument that you're making further. There is the gun dealer's defence, isn't there? Or the gun dealer's argument.
Yeah.
Or the crime boss's argument. Help us understand that around whether or not we can rightly hold liable fossil fuel companies and what that would look like.
Well, I think a good way to understand it is not think about fossil fuels for a moment and imagine, so if someone out there says to me, I'm feeling murderous today and I'm going to shoot someone. And I say, well, today's your lucky day because I happen to have a weapon in my pocket and I'm going to sell it to you. Now, if I sell that weapon and then the worst happens and the person goes and murders someone, they go to jail, they've done the crime, but I'm complicit. I've supplied something that was crucial to that crime, and I ought to be found guilty as well. And I think that's the situation that the fossil fuel companies find themselves in.
They would push back pretty hard at that. I mean, they don't. A coal company CEO doesn't wake up in the morning and go, "Oh, I'm going to do someone deadly harm today."
No, they don't think that. That's not why they're doing what they do. They're doing what they do to get a return for shareholders, but that's no excuse. They know, as Ian's pointed out, these commodities, coal, oil, gas, and indeed uranium, are what I call single-use commodities. As Ian points out, they're not making paperweights. No one's making sculptures out of coal. So they're negligent in not knowing what their product does. And in that sense, they're complicit in the harms that their product does when it's consumed. Now, they naturally say, well, look, if we don't sell coal, if BHP doesn't sell coal or some other company, then a company in Indonesia might sell coal. And my response to that is to say, that's not why you're doing it. You're not selling coal to stop the poor old Indonesian companies being complicit in climate harms. No, that's not why you're doing it. You will do it anyway. And also, I think it's implausible to say that it wouldn't have a huge impact if Australia decided we're not going to sell fossil fuels anymore. If we called last drinks on the fossil fuel industry, it would send shockwaves through the other countries that export coal. And indeed, I claim that Australia should form what I call a reverse OPEC. That is, it should team up with Norway and Canada and other rich countries that export fossil fuels to phase down the production of fossil fuels. But look, going back to the moral question, it's a bit like saying, if I said, look, if I announced on stage that I was going to burgle your hotel room at 12 o'clock today, because I knew you wouldn't be here because you'd be on stage, and then someone in the audience got in first, right, and burgled your hotel room, and then their defence was,
be my guest.
He was going to do it.
If their defence was, it would have happened anyway.
I'm clearly
Someone else
dripping
was
in
going to do
jewels
it.
as an ABC employee.
Yep, we know where the money is. But if the burglar who got in first said, oh, it was going to happen anyway, well, we'd laugh at them. That's a schoolyard defence, and that's the kind of defence that the fossil fuel companies use, and I don't think morally it has any weight at all.
But they also say, I remember interviewing Germany's biggest electricity supplier around a climate justice series we were doing, and that, they said, well, we're only one link in a chain, we're just providing a service. But it's the consumer demand. The consumers are just as culpable as us. If we're going to measure culpability, well, they didn't say that. They point to consumers and their customer as absolutely key as well.
But the consumer has no choice. I mean, when you turn on the power switch, you don't know what technology is providing the electricity. It might be a solar panel on your roof, it might be a coal-fired power station, it might be a gas-fired power station. If you're in Europe, it could be a nuclear power station. You don't have that choice. But I remember when Malcolm Fraser approved the export of uranium, he told the House, an energy-starved world needs our uranium.
He saw it as an equity issue.
Yes, that children were freezing to death in the dark because we had selfishly not sold our uranium. Well, at the moment, I think nuclear power provides 5.7% of the world's electricity, and we probably supply about a tenth of the uranium. So we account for about 1/2% of the world's electricity. The basic point is that the losses in distribution systems are greater than the electricity provided by Australian uranium. We are not doing anything to provide energy justice by helping to provide what is now the most expensive form of generating electricity that there is, and the one that provides a legacy of waste that needs to be managed for geological time, which I'd argue is almost criminally irresponsible. I remember saying in the 70s that if we really had no choice, no other way of keeping the lights on but to have nuclear power, I would grit my teeth and say, well, in principle, the problems of waste are technically soluble, and in principle, the problems of proliferation might be amenable to some sort of political solution, although that's really defying everything we know about human nature. But we do have alternatives. And now that solar and wind are a quarter of the price of nuclear power, it's economically irresponsible to encourage countries to use nuclear electricity rather than clean energy.
More to talk about there. Jeremy, you wanted to pick up on something.
Oh, well, look, Ian makes a good point, and the same argument that he's contesting with nuclear is also made about coal. So you might remember Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister, saying that coal is good for humanity. And when you look at Australia's thermal coal exports, that is the coal that generates electricity, most of it doesn't go to China and India. 60% of it goes to Japan and South Korea. Only 5% goes to India. So when we're talking about leaving the lights on, last time I checked, Japan, South Korea, they're wealthy nations. They can afford a transition. So the lights aren't going to go off because we stop exporting thermal coal in particular.
So this, for you, this argument, justice-based argument for mitigating global warming, it is about ultimately how do we fund a climate transition to a future where we lower emissions and we don't emit, we don't exacerbate global warming. So how would you hold fossil fuels liable? What would they stump up, and who would you distribute the funds to?
So what I think needs to happen first and foremost, obviously we need to stop approving new mines. There are dozens and dozens of new mines in various stages of approval. Not all will get approved. So we have to stop that. What we need is a national account, a national accounting system about the costs that are incurred by extracting and exporting coal, oil and gas. And those costs are not just climate costs, they're decommissioning the 100 coal mines that exist in Australia. So APPIA, the peak body for the oil and gas industry, has estimated that decommissioning offshore oil, just offshore oil, might cost $60 billion over 30 years. And that doesn't include the 100 coal mines, it doesn't include the vast gas fields and so on. So we actually need to work out what the costs of decommissioning these pieces of infrastructure are and what the climate costs are. And we need to ensure that these companies pay them. And to give you an example of how important this is, so BHP, actually the biggest emitter in Australia when you look at exports, it's just sold its oil and gas business to another fossil fuel producer, Woodside. It's also in the process of selling its coking coal business.
So that's their way of getting out of the industry.
Yeah, and look, lots of people say, wow, a big miner taking climate change seriously, getting out of the industry, that's a good thing, right? It's not a good thing. It's a very bad thing, and I'll tell you why. Because when you sell a coal mine, one, guess what happens to that coal mine? Someone buys it and they produce coal. In fact, they produce coal quicker and quicker before the industry is going. He'll go bust and he'll leave big holes in the ground for Australian taxpayers to pay. So big fossil fuel producers ought not to be allowed to sell their assets. They ought to have to decommission their assets and put aside enough money to address the costs, whether they be for the workers, for the environment, or for the climate. That's the big thing that I think needs to happen for fossil fuel companies. There's many other things. They donate hundreds of millions of dollars to political parties. Labor, Liberal, doesn't make much difference. They're staffers, former staffers. So the person who runs the Office of Prime Minister and Cabinet was the former climate advisor to the Minerals Council of Australia, which is the peak body for the mining industry. So, I mean, that sort of outrageous revolving door policy that we see, it has a pernicious effect, I argue, on climate change policy and action in Australia. So we need to stop donations and political influence as well.
Yeah. Agreed.
Ian Lowe.
Agreed, and decommissioning costs is also an issue in the nuclear industry because an international study found that many nuclear power stations that are no longer economic are still running because as long as they're running, even at a loss, they appear as an asset on their balance sheet. When they stop operating, they will appear as a liability, the cost of decommissioning. And the cost of decommissioning a large nuclear power station is of the order of $1 or $2 billion. And that international study argued that some of the nuclear power authorities in the world are basically bankrupt and they can't afford the cost of decommissioning. So what's likely to happen is, as with the coal mines, that they will file for bankruptcy, having made a profit in the short term selling nuclear electricity, and then the taxpayers of their country will be left with the liability of decommissioning the old nuclear power stations and making the venue safe for the community.
Ian, we can't... Sorry, Jeremy, do you want to...
So I think this is a really important point, and how I'd characterise it is that what's going on right now is a great big shifting of risk from the private sector to the public sector. That's happening with nuclear, it's happening with fossil fuels, and this will have enormous consequences for whether we're able to raise enough money and spend enough money appropriately to address the kind of issues we need, whether it's climate or hospitals or whatever it is. This risk shifting that's going on I think is one of the great injustices that is likely to happen if we don't get our response right.
We also can't afford to experience what's ahead in relation to global warming. This is going to be a very costly, dangerous, deadly exercise for future generations to come. And so one solution, Ian Lowe, has been, well, all benefits come with costs. Nuclear industry, nuclear power has lower emissions associated with it than coal-fired power stations.
Yes,
so in your mind, is nuclear energy a viable greenhouse gas limited, climate-friendly solution for the globe's energy supply?
Well, the short answer is no. I mean, the longer answer is that it remains true as it was in the 1970s, that if nuclear power is the answer, it was a very silly question. When 10 years ago, Barry Brook and I wrote a so-called flip book about nuclear power, it didn't have a back cover, it had two front covers. And on one side it said nuclear power yes, and there was an essay by Barry Brook saying why we should have nuclear power, followed by my critique. And if you turned it over, it said nuclear power no, and there was my essay followed by Barry's critique. And at the time, it was legitimate to argue that the promised Generation 4 reactors and small modular reactors might avoid the problems that we have with the current generation of reactors. And at the time, nuclear electricity was marginally cheaper than wind power and about a third the price of solar energy.
So it was
that was
a viable
10 years ago, it was a legitimate argument. Last year, average world prices, solar power 3.7 cents a kilowatt hour, wind power 4.1 cents, gas 6 cents, coal 11 cents, nuclear 16 cents. So it's not just a bit more expensive, it's 4 times as expensive. And that's why the more realistic of the International Atomic Energy Agency projections shows nuclear power shrinking from the current 5.7% of electricity to 2.8% in 2050. Basically, there are a few countries where there is no democratic decision-making that are still building nuclear power stations, most obviously China. But the amount of nuclear capacity worldwide will probably decline this decade because the old power stations in Western Europe and North America aren't being replaced because it doesn't make economic sense to do so. In fact, the running cost of old nuclear power stations that have amortised their capital is now greater than the cost of electricity from new solar farms or large wind turbines. So nobody using shareholders' money is investing in nuclear power. And the only place where it's still going ahead is where there are authoritarian governments who don't care what the people think and who aren't reliant on private capital.
And Fukushima, the disaster in Fukushima was really that with the earthquake and typhoon were really a line in the sand. That was a line in the sand moment, wasn't it? Germany got out almost instantly off the back of that.
Yes,
It's
that's right. I mean, after 3 Mile Island, there was a meltdown, but no radiation was released. And so the nuclear industry said, well, there can be an accident that destroys a nuclear power station, but it won't harm innocent civilians. Then Chernobyl happened, and that rendered a whole area of Ukraine uninhabitable. But they said, well, that was poor Soviet technology and no safety culture. But what Fukushima showed is that even in an advanced society with a theoretically good regulator, the precautions that should have been taken were not taken because the regulator didn't enforce obvious safety measures like having venting to ensure that hydrogen was released rather than resulting in explosions. So I think
there's an argument that because part of our uranium went into
absolutely
a majority of those plants.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So we are potentially liable.
Absolutely.
Is the argument that some make.
Yeah. And extending Jeremy's argument, I was interested to see the Sandy Hook legal case in the US, where a court held that those who supplied the weapons were partly responsible because if weapons hadn't been supplied, the deranged individual couldn't have shot small children. And similarly, I think you could argue that if our uranium hadn't been sold, then the Fukushima disaster could not have happened. So in the end, we are likely to be held responsible for the consequences. And
aren't the UK and France building new power stations though?
Well, they are, but they're years behind schedule. They're billions over budget. In fact, the only reason that Hinkley Point is still being built in the UK is that the government has guaranteed that they will be able to get a return, a price for the electricity, which is about 3 times what it costs to produce offshore wind or even gas turbines. So basically, the taxpayer is writing a huge cheque to subsidise nuclear power and keep it going. And what this draws attention to is that originally the nuclear energy industry was a public relations stunt to distract attention from the fact that the reactors were built to supply plutonium for the bomb. Calder Hall reactor was built to produce the British bomb, and Queen Elizabeth turning on the switch and providing enough electricity to power about 100 houses was simply a public relations stunt to distract attention from why they were building nuclear power stations. And I think it's probably true that the only sovereign nations that are still building nuclear power stations with public subsidies are because they want to maintain their nuclear weapons capacity. But that's the dirty secret that the industry doesn't like people to talk about.
In a few minutes, I'm going to encourage you to ask questions, and there's a microphone just there underneath the... yep, you know where to go. Good. And don't hold back. If you're feeling a little bit, I can't be bothered walking across to the other side, please do, because we'd love to hear from you. So, yeah, just line up behind that microphone, socially distanced, of course, and we'd love to hear from you. Even if we could, Jeremy Moss, attribute a price to the emissions associated with the fossil fuel exports that we send off to the rest of the world, or our fossil fuel companies do, what then? How do we decide where that money goes?
No, look, that's a very good question. And look, I suppose I'm a little bit unusual in my response to this. So most people would say that, just say we could extract some money from these fossil fuel companies and deal with their batteries of lawyers and so on.
And good luck with that.
Yes, yes, indeed. Well, we have a mechanism for this. It's called the tax system. Unfortunately, there's too many holes in it. But if we could, for instance, extract a lot of money, the natural thought is that we would put that money to building new solar parks and wind turbines and so on. And indeed, we should do some of that. But I think the extension of the argument I make is that if we are responsible for climate harms through our enabling of the fossil fuel export industry, we should send some of that money where the harms occur. So as we know, Australia is very vulnerable to climate harms, but we're not nearly so vulnerable as other countries because we're wealthy and we can do things to mitigate the damage and to adapt, whereas other people can't. And I think we have a moral obligation to divert some of the resources that we might use for a climate transition to help others transition. And it may even be we divert a very large part of that money that we might raise to do that. And so I think our focus should not be just on transitioning ourselves, because if everyone here gets free renewable energy, for instance, then that's an enormous benefit to everyone here. Yes, it is the case that we reduce emissions, but we get all the other benefits and keep them for ourselves. Whereas if we send some of that money elsewhere, they get some of the benefits as well, rather than just us. And to some degree, I'm both sort of captivated and repulsed by this talk about Australia being an energy export superpower. Yes, we can export green hydrogen, we can build solar power and run a cable to Singapore or wherever it is. But that's a bit like saying, we've made you sick, now we're going to sell you the cure. And I don't think it should be that simple. I think part of what we do ought to be fixing the problems we've caused elsewhere.
So when you look at the UN... When you look at the UN climate negotiations and the complexity and chaos and enormity of that process, do you see a point in our future where the case you're making could be actually enabled and enacted and administrated across the globe?
I do see that point. I just think that point will be too late, unfortunately. But look, there's lots of things we can do about that. So the biggest private delegation to the COP negotiations was from fossil fuel companies. That's easy to stop. Just tell them they can't come. That would be a terrific thing. There are green shoots on the horizon. So there's the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, partly initiated by countries like Denmark, which seek to ban fossil fuels and so on, to try and get almost like a non-proliferation treaty for fossil fuels, things like that. But I think really we can't rely on global negotiations. We have to act first. States have to get together, and that's why I put forward this idea about the reverse OPEC. States that are causing the problem have to get together and take action. Like, there's no point waiting...
Independent of the federal government?
Yes.
Or in concert with?
That's true. You correct me there. So by states I was meaning national governments.
Oh, you mean national governments,
but
of course,
I
sorry.
also think...
You make a case, though, about the states need to work independently.
In advance and independently of the global negotiations if they're not going fast enough. But so do states, as you remind me, states as in Victoria, South Australia. And they are doing that. So Australia has no real sort of commitment to achieving net zero, or we have one by 2050. But the states do. The states have interim emission targets that are actually quite robust.
Yes.
Now, most of the states still approve fossil fuel export projects, so they need to fix that immediately. But it shows what is possible when the federal governments around the world don't take enough actions. Smaller political entities can take action, and that's a really good sign.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the pandemic. I mean, the monumental incompetence of the Commonwealth government forced the states to step up and keep us safe during the pandemic. And in energy, the monumental incompetence of the Commonwealth government has caused even governments with states with liberal governments like South Australia and New South Wales to step up and set robust targets and invest in solar and wind and storage. And I've argued for a long time that local government is closer to the community than federal government, because nearly everybody knows one of their local councillors. And the closer to the people you get, the more likely it is that the government will respond to what the people want. I mean, what Commonwealth election shows is that bullshit and advertising prevails. But at the local level, people replace those who don't respond to their wishes.
I know there's fair bit of corruption in local councils around Australia too, so I don't know. I'm not sure about that. Hey, let's go to questions because you're queuing up at length. If you could keep them fairly brief and with a question at the end, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Yes,
a question
thank
mark, I mean.
Thank you so much, both Ian and Jeremy. This is urgent. We've been told by the experts we've got until 2030. We just heard Jeremy say that we may be acting too late. And this is what I sort of feel like we've reached a point where we're preaching to the converted here. And we've heard all of this, as Ian said, since the 1970s. And I'd like to hear, we've heard some solutions. You know, I'm very interested in hearing about corporate responsibility. You know, we have circular economies in Europe. Why can't we have circular fossil fuel companies, corporates? So my question really is, you've talked about a moral response. We don't see that. Surely the answer is not just a vote. Could we please hear some solutions to the moral argument?
Thank you.
And how can we act?
Thanks for the question. The circular economy, that's an interesting proposition, isn't it, Jeremy?
Yeah, look, it is. In terms of...
you might need to explain what that means.
I'm not sure I'm the best person for that, but look, in terms of some solutions for the sort of corporate misbehaviour that you have with the major fossil fuel producing companies, look, we can ask them to be moral. As the questioner points out, probably not likely to happen. Unfortunately, this is a thing that moral philosophers learn very early on, that moral arguments aren't quite as forceful as you think. But I think they need to have pressure put on them at all sorts of different points, whether it's by shareholders. But really, I think what we need to pressure governments not to give them a free ride. We need to pressure governments not to give easy approvals for their mines, to not have tax loopholes you could drive a super tanker through, and to make them pay their costs. I think that has to come from political movements, really, and I don't think there's much of a shortcut for that, unfortunately.
Yeah. I remember Jonathan Braithwaite, when he was Professor of Criminology at ANU, saying he believed in capital punishment. He believed their capital should be confiscated. And he said, the only thing that will change corporate behaviour is if there is a financial cost, because ultimately the directors are answerable to their shareholders. The sign of hope I see is independents like Zali Steggall, and I'd wager that there will be 4 or 5 similar independents elected at the next election. So whoever's in power will be beholden to very active, very well-informed independents who will demand serious climate action. And if there's one thing we can all do, it's ensure that those people get a following wind in the election campaign.
Interesting times ahead. Thank you. Next question.
Is there a case for, in fact, taking action to accelerate the decommissioning process? I grit my teeth as I say that. It does involve transferring risk from the private to the public. But it seems to me unless we actually act to accelerate decommissioning, and that probably does mean government money going in to make that happen at the speed we need to make it happen, isn't that a key part of getting where we need to get to in time?
Thank you. I'm going to take another question as well, so hold that one about accelerating, just because I can see a big queue there and I'd like to include most of you.
Question to Jeremy Moss. Morality is all very well, but it generally doesn't get your analogy a little further. If you sell a gun to someone who's feeling murderous and he turns around and shoots you, then you've got a self-interest argument rather than a moral argument. How can we drive that moral argument home to people to get them to take action?
Yeah, go for it.
No, thank you. It's a really good question. Look, first of all, one thing that morality does is provides us with a guidebook, okay? And it's not always simple, but if I tell you that you or the Australian public will be paying tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to pay the clean-up costs that these companies have caused, that should outrage you, okay? That should tell you what you need to demand based on that moral argument. So that the moral argument is a guide, even if it doesn't motivate everyone that it should. It enables us to say, no, this is wrong, this is unjust, my hospital isn't being built, my seawall is falling apart because there's not enough money because it's being absorbed by these companies. So morality performs that very important function. And it's, you correctly point out that self-interest arguments work. Well, they're moral too, all right? It's perfectly moral for me to say that I shouldn't be shot randomly by someone on the street. That's something that I demand of my government, is to ensure that I'm safe to do that. I'm safe to walk around on the street. Going back to the previous question that was put about shouldn't we hasten the decline of these industries, I think that is absolutely true. And I'm going to utter a dirty word here, and that is nationalisation. I don't necessarily think that these things should be nationalised, but it's one option that should be on the table. The crucial thing, I think, with what should happen with mines, coal mines and so on, as we phase them out, is that governments should ensure that that's done properly. Now, you know, we need some decent governments in order for that to be the case, but the key thing is control. We can't just leave this up to the private sector. We know how that ends. It ends with abandoned mines, public safety risks, and huge costs being shifted onto the public. So we need public control of that process.
And there is a cost of decommissioning, but we now have the ludicrous situation where informed directors of private sector companies are proposing to decommission coal-fired power stations, and they're being bullied by the Commonwealth Government to keep the bloody things running. I mean, how outrageous is that?
Let's take a couple more questions. Thank you.
Okay, my question's for Ian. You mentioned the terrible consequences of a weapons-grade nuclear submarine being destroyed either remotely or close to a coastline. And this raises the question, of course, of access to weapons-grade material, which you commented was usually only available through building a nuclear power plant. But surely an AUKUS-type deal can be justified by many countries who are non-nuclear, as Australia is, with the objective of getting hands on or producing within their own country weapons-grade uranium. Can you comment on the potential damage that could cause, and the fact that really the Labor government got totally wedged on it? And I support your concept of voting in a whole bunch of independents who can carry their moral justifications through to a vote in the lower house rather than being dissuaded by their parties.
Thanks for your question.
I make the comment
Ian.
in my book that Malcolm Fraser, who approved the export of uranium in 1977, in 2014 wrote an opinion piece that was improbably printed in The Australian, which some of us can remember once having been a serious newspaper. But they actually published this opinion piece in which he said, basically, the more countries have nuclear technology, the more countries will have nuclear weapons. The more countries have nuclear weapons, the more likely it is that a desperate or deranged person will use them. And really, before we wake up to the sight of a city in ashes, we should reconsider our enthusiasm to export uranium. And I think that's the critical point, that really it was a technology that was around for a few decades. It arguably produced cleaner electricity than burning coal, but we now recognise the attendant dangers, and I think the sooner we phase it out, the better.
I like the cheese-based argument myself. I buy that one. Thank you. I also just want to acknowledge that some of you are joining us remotely via the UNSW Centre for Ideas. If you want to ask a question, I'm not going to be able to see it, but you might want to share a comment, and the hashtag for the festival is, I think it's #ADLWW, as in Adelaide Writers Festival, #ADLWW. I probably should have said that at the beginning, but I'd love to see your participation too if you're joining us on the live stream. Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to add a question for Ian. Ian, of course there'd be
Just come a bit closer to the mic if you can.
Yeah, I have a question for you. Of course, a lot of people are opposed to the nuclear submarines here in SA, to the mining of uranium, which we're very responsible for, the production of waste. There's a lot of concern, but what can the people individually do to create change apart from voting? So when they leave here, what can they actually do?
Well, as well, before voting, I think the one thing we can all do is write to our Member of Parliament and say that we're concerned about this issue, because I remember asking a Member of Parliament why they were doing so little about climate change 20 years ago. Or letter they get about climate change, they get 10 about schools or hospitals or roads, and it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. You know, it's only the only thing that politicians
Change the world for the better.
They do, but
Believe it or not.
I mean, the argument in Queensland is that politicians are like bananas. When they go in, they're straight but green, and after a few years, they're yellow and bent like all the rest.
Well, have you ever done a stand-up comedy show? I just have always thought you should. Now, who's still in the queue? Pop your hand up. And all the people at the back, are you all still in the queue too, or you're just watching? You're just watching. Okay. Last question. Thank you.
Okay, bit of a cheat question, because I want to ask you both to comment. Something that hasn't arisen is the people who have suffered the most from both injuries in Australia, and that is the Aboriginal people, the owners of the land. And this is ongoing. We have the fight over at Kimber with the Bungala people to not have a dump on their land. We have the recent floods in South Australia highlighting risks both at Kimber and at Olympic Dam, and of course across Australia we have the risks of fracking and the assault on the Artesian Basin. So I'd like to ask both to comment on that. Thank you.
Ian.
Well, the fundamental principle should be that Indigenous people have the right to prior informed consent before anything's done on their land. And I think it's a scandal that the process that the Commonwealth Government set up about the proposed low-level waste repository at Kimber. Basically, they conducted an opinion survey of the landowners, and they said that the Bar people were not landowners, and therefore they weren't allowed to be consulted. They are challenging that at the moment in the federal court, but Indigenous people shouldn't have to go to the court to have their opinion heard in a project that affects their land. And I think what Annie is drawing attention to is a general problem that was discussed yesterday by Julianne Schultz and Claire Coleman, that historically we have acted as if terra nullius, which was ruled out by the courts nearly 30 years ago, as if it was still prevailed, that we could still make decisions without consulting the traditional owners. And if we recognise that we're on Kaurna land, and that it always was and always will be Kaurna land, and the Kaurna people are entitled to be consulted about what's done. And one of the...
And more than consulted, get to decide.
Right. But it does raise a quite fundamental point, which I mentioned briefly in passing in my book, but if you want to see the full argument, you'll have to buy it, hint, hint, which is that we are producing radioactive waste and it has to be stored somewhere. But everywhere in Australia is the land of one group or another of Indigenous people. And every time there's been a proposal for a waste repository, the Indigenous people involved have said we don't want it. So how do we resolve that dilemma that everywhere in Australia is Aboriginal land, but whenever they're consulted, the Aboriginal people don't want the radioactive waste there, but we are still producing radioactive waste? And the only answer is to stop producing the waste, isn't it?
And the legacy of Maralinga lives long in many people's lives. Last comment to you, Jeremy Moss.
Oh, thank you. So I think that last question was really good, and Ian's put it very well. But I think it raises a broader issue in that when we respond to climate change, or indeed the problems of safely disposing nuclear waste, we can't just leave these kind of justice considerations as an afterthought. They have to be front and centre of our approach, not a co-benefit, not something we do at the end, but something that is fundamental to how we approach the problem. Because otherwise, particularly with climate change, one way of thinking of it is that there's all these brute injustices, such as the impacts of extreme weather events and so on. Then there's the second kind of injustice, which is the injustice of responding in the wrong way. And that's what we're in danger of doing when we ignore the interests of Indigenous people, for instance, but many other people as well. And so we have to put those kind of interests and those kind of justice claims at the front of our response to climate and indeed the nuclear problem.
Well, one of my colleagues says we would make better decisions everywhere if we routinely asked ourselves, what will our grandchildren think of this decision? Will they think we were wise, far-seeing, or will they think we were selfish and short-sighted? And I suspect not too many recent decisions by our governments would pass the grandchildren test.
The grandchildren test. It's been terrific to join you today. It's the first live festival I've done since the beginning of the pandemic, and it's unbelievable to see you all in the flesh. Just such a treat. Such a treat to hear these two brains on stage. And what we'd love you to do now is support authors and their works who have also suffered during the pandemic by heading over to the quick sales counter. Ian's book, Ian Lowe, Long Half-Life, the Nuclear Industry in Australia. Jeremy Moss's book, Carbon Justice, the Scandal of Australia's Biggest Contribution to Climate Change. You can buy them now from the bookshop, but also our two authors are going to be doing a book signing right now there, right near the front gate over that way, near the bookshop. So go and say hello and get a signature and enjoy the rest of your festival. Thank you so much for supporting it. And thank you to Ian and Jeremy.
And thank you, Natasha.
Thank you, Natasha.
Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Just a quick announcement, as usual. We would ask that you try to stick with the COVID management plan that is in place, which is wear a mask wherever you can. Obviously, it would help immensely for yourself, protect other people. If you're in a group, stay with your group. Don't bother touching strangers.